She spat in my face literally. At the dinner table in front of her sons, her sisters, and even the neighbors she'd invited just to mock me. "You're nothing but a low-class leech." She hissed, her breath thick with wine and cruelty. I sat there stunned, swallowing the insult like I'd swallowed everyone before. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my late father, a quiet immigrant with calloused hands and a brilliant mind, left behind a fortune so vast it could buy the house we were sitting in 10 times over. That was the night I stopped apologizing. I'm Jasmine Tran, and I live in California. And I'm done kneeling before people who think I owe them gratitude for their insults. They say humiliation tastes bitter, but I swear to you that night it tasted metallic, like blood, like rust, like the acid of every insult I'd ever swallowed rising up to choke me. I was sitting at the long oak table in Beverly's dining room, the room she always boasted had once hosted a senator, though I've never seen proof. The chandelier glittered above us like it was mocking me, casting a spotlight over my shame as she raised her wine glass and with the most casual cruelty called me a leech from the lowlands. Her exact words were, "I don't know where Jason found you, Jasmine. Somewhere low class, I assume. Somewhere without mirrors." Then she laughed. Laughed. The room did too, some politely, some with relief, some with that twisted eagerness people feel when they know someone else is about to bleed, and it's not them. And when I didn't respond, when I sat there frozen, my jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. She spat, right in my face. I should have stood up. I should have screamed, thrown my wine in her face, stormed out. But I didn't. I wiped the spit from my cheek with a linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on my lap. I smiled. That was the moment I stopped pretending. "I know what you're thinking. Why didn't you leave long ago? Why would a woman tolerate this? Why suffer years of slights, of dinner table daggers, of whispered gossip about my family and upbringing? The truth, because I loved Jason, or at least I thought I did. He was charming in the beginning. He said my simplicity grounded him. He said my background made me authentic, as if I were some exotic fruit he could show off to his entitled friends. I thought that was affection. I didn't realize it was packaging. He loved how I looked beside him, not how I lived within myself. And I stayed because I believed I had to earn my place. Jason's family was old money from San Francisco real estate oil, and a lot of talk about legacy. My family immigrants from Vietnam who built everything they had with their hands and their backs. My father was a janitor who worked nights and took engineering classes during the day. He used to fall asleep at the kitchen table with calluses cracking open, always smiling. I used to be ashamed of that. I'm not anymore. Because what none of them knew, not Jason, not Beverly, not the smirking cousins or pearl-clutching aunts, was that my father was a genius. Quiet, unpolished, humble, but brilliant. He held the patent on a heat sensor mechanism that became standard in over 60% of modern HVAC systems. He sold it quietly, put the money into investments, and told no one, not even me, until he was dying. 3 weeks before he passed, he gave me a small fireproof box. He said, "This will protect you one day when the world decides you're too small to matter." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. But that night, with Beverly's spit drying on my cheek and Jason pretending not to notice, I did. I mattered, just not to them. And that was the last night I would ever beg to be seen. After dinner, Beverly hugged Jason goodbye and air-kissed the others. She didn't even glance at me. I stood by the door in silence, holding my purse like a child holding a lunchbox, waiting for permission to leave. Jason finally said, "You know how she is. She's just drunk. Don't take it personally." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I nodded, got into the passenger seat, and stared out the window while Jason drove us home, humming some oblivious tune like nothing had happened. But in my mind, something had happened. something irreversible. That night I went into our shared closet, pulled down the old fireproof box, and opened it for the first time in years. Inside were the following: 3 manila folders labeled Assets Trust and Transference. A notarized statement from his attorney confirming the liquidation value of his holdings, $7.4 million. A letter, just one, written in his shaky but deliberate hand. If they ever make you feel small, remember, they don't know whose blood you carry. Use this money only when you're ready to stop surviving and start reclaiming. Love, Dad. I read that letter 3 times. Then I turned off the bedroom light and lay beside Jason in silence, listening to him snore softly. And in that darkness, something inside me shifted, hardened, evolved. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I planned. I've kept their secrets. I've kept mine. But soon Beverly is going to learn the truth. She will learn that the woman she spat on was richer, smarter, and more powerful than she ever dared to imagine. That while she paraded her pearls and whispered about my immigrant smell, I was legally purchasing the ground beneath her feet. And Jason, he'll learn that the moment you let your mother humiliate your wife is the moment you forfeit your right to call her mine. My name is Jasmine Tran, and I live in California. I've played the polite outsider long enough. It's time to play something else entirely. You don't just wake up one day and realize you've been disrespected for years. It seeps in slowly like damp through drywall, silent, corrosive, unnoticeable, until the structure begins to rot. I didn't see the rot until it was everywhere, until I couldn't breathe without tasting mold. From the very beginning, Beverly never saw me as a person. I was an accessory to her son's image, a flesh and blood backdrop to his ambition. She used to introduce me at events by saying, "This is Jason's wife. She's sweet." That word sweet always sounded like an insult coming from her, like I was a puppy who didn't bark or a cheap perfume she didn't want to smell. I told myself it would change, that if I just smiled enough, helped enough, cooked enough, folded enough linens during family events, she'd come around. But I was wrong. It didn't get better. It got cleverer. There was the time I made bonchung for Lunar New Year and brought it to her house. She smiled and said, "How exotic," before whispering to Jason when she thought I couldn't hear. "Be careful with food like that. You don't want the smell sticking to your clothes." Another time I offered to help her plan her retirement party, she handed me the guest list with my own name scratched out and said, "You'll have your hands full anyway with the kitchen, dear." And Jason? He always shrugged. "Don't make it a big deal. You know how she is? She's old-fashioned. Old-fashioned. As if racism was just a quaint tradition. As if being insulted in front of his cousins and then asked to take family photos like The Help was some normal rite of passage. Still, I stayed quiet. I wanted to be the bigger person. I wanted to be respected. I didn't realize back then that respect isn't something you earn from people like Beverly. It's something they give only when they fear you. The moment that burned me the most, though, came 2 years ago. Jason and I had been trying to have a child. I'd had a miscarriage the year before, and Beverly in her Sunday best and crocodile tear tone leaned across the brunch table and asked, "Have you considered that your background might be the issue? There's a lot of, complications with mixed bloodlines." She said it like she was asking about the weather, and I just lowered my eyes and nodded like some shamefaced servant. I remember holding the fork in my hand, thinking how easy it would be to jab it into the table just once to make a sound to disrupt the silence I'd allowed her to shape around me. But I didn't, because Jason didn't defend me, because my silence had become a habit, because at that point I still believed that dignity meant enduring cruelty with grace. There's something dangerous about a woman who begins to question her silence. After the night she spat on me, I started reliving every insult. Not just the obvious ones, the backhanded compliments, the digs at my accent when I was tired and slipped into Vietnamese syntax, but the ones that were disguised as kindness. She gave me a cookbook once. "Something easy for beginners," she said. It was filled with recipes for white bread casseroles and gelatin molds. She bought me a blouse for my birthday 2 sizes too big, beige shapeless. Something appropriate for Jason's office dinners, she explained. When I wore my own red dress to the next one, she pulled me aside in the bathroom and said, "You don't want people to think you're trying too hard." What she meant was, you don't belong here. Not in this family, not at this table, not in this life. But she never said it directly, because Beverly knew how to smile while cutting you open. Now looking back, I see that every moment was training. She wasn't just trying to belittle me, she was testing boundaries, seeing how much she could say, how far she could go before I broke. And Jason let her. I had spent years thinking I was preserving peace, but I wasn't preserving anything. I was complicit. Every time I said nothing, every time I smiled through another dehumanizing joke, I helped build the throne she sat on when she finally spat in my face. But now the silence is over. It's strange how anger can feel like freedom. That night after I opened my father's box and read his letter, something inside me realigned. I wasn't just Jason's wife. I wasn't Beverly's victim. I wasn't that quiet girl smiling through contempt. I was the daughter of a genius, the sole beneficiary of his empire, and the owner of a weapon none of them even suspected existed. And I was done waiting. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table while Jason scrolled through his phone, oblivious. I studied his face, the familiar lines of comfort and indifference, and realized I didn't love him anymore. I wasn't even sure I liked him. He asked if I wanted to visit his mother the following weekend. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Let's make sure it's a visit she never forgets." He laughed. I smiled. But this time, my smile wasn't sweet. There's a moment in every crumbling relationship when the truth crystallizes, not in a fight, not in an apology, but in something colder: silence. Jason's silence after every one of Beverly's attacks was the loudest betrayal of all. It wasn't that he screamed at me or hit me or cheated. No, Jason betrayed me by staying quiet when I needed him loud. After that dinner, after the spit, after the laughter, after the silence in the car ride home, I tried to look at Jason and see the man I married. I searched his face for traces of the warmth that used to pull me in. But all I saw was convenience. He was comfortable. He didn't want waves. He didn't want drama. He wanted his mother's approval and his wife's silence, and he'd balanced that trade-off perfectly for years. He never chose me, not really. Even the way he asked me out in the beginning, he said, "You're not like the women I usually date." That's refreshing. I thought that meant I was special. Now I realize it meant I was easy to control. That weekend I confronted him, not with yelling or tears, but with questions, the kind that cut deeper than any accusation. I asked, "Why didn't you say something when your mother spat on me?" He blinked. I didn't want to escalate things. I asked, "Why have you never once defended me in front of her?" He said, "Because it's not worth the drama, Jasmine. You always make things about you." There it was. The cold truth. I wasn't his wife, I was an obligation he managed. A cultural checkbox he could use to say he wasn't racist, wasn't shallow, wasn't weak, even though he was all those things. Then he added something that scorched a hole in me. "You need to stop being so sensitive. You act like you're owed something." Owed. I thought of the nights I stayed up with his sick father feeding him soup, while Jason was out drinking with friends. I thought of the weekend I canceled my job interview to attend Beverly's bridge tournament. I thought of every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and birthday I'd spent serving his family while mine sat alone on the other side of town, uninvited. If that wasn't giving, what was? But that's the thing about men like Jason. They see your sacrifices as expectations, not generosity. They expect gratitude when they tolerate your presence, but give none when you're the one holding everything together behind the curtain. I realized something else that morning. Jason was never neutral. He wasn't caught in the middle. He was on her side. Always had been. The insults he laughed off, he believed them. The The jokes about my accent he joined in when I wasn't around. The snide comments about my cheap shoes or thrift store makeup. He echoed them in subtle ways, gifting me clothing I'd never wear, saying I needed to level up for his work dinners. He wanted me polished, silenced, and grateful. But what he got was me, fully awake, fully armed, and suddenly uninterested in shrinking myself to fit his life. That day I called my attorney. Not for divorce, not yet. I needed time to build, time to prepare. You see the house we lived in? It was in his name, but the mortgage was barely surviving, and the bank had started breathing down our necks. Beverly had co-signed it to help him out, but used it as leverage to remind me of my place. But they didn't know what I now knew. My father had left me not just wealth, but access. Through shell corporations, trusts, and business accounts, I could move quietly. I could become invisible until I was undeniable. And that's what I did. I started small. I closed the joint account and opened one in my name. I began gathering financial documents, tracking debt, and taking notes on every insult, every email, every whisper that could become leverage. Jason noticed. He asked if I was okay. I said, "I'm just tired." He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said, "Don't worry, Mom will come around." She wouldn't, but I would. Around the corner, with a wrecking ball made of patience planning and a dead man's empire. You know what's the cruelest part? Even now, he still thinks I'm the problem. He thinks if I'd just lighten up, be more fun, play along, everything would go back to normal. But what he calls normal is what nearly killed me emotionally, spiritually, and eventually financially. No more. I refuse to spend another year, another month, another minute being punished for being different. For being me. Jason may have chosen comfort, but I am choosing control. And Beverly, she's about to lose the very thing she weaponized against me, her reputation, her property, and her power. My father wasn't the kind of man you noticed in a crowd. He didn't command rooms or shake hands with politicians. He didn't boast about his accomplishments or correct people when they mispronounced his name, but he was the strongest person I've ever known. He had this way of being invisible in plain sight, always watching, always calculating. People assumed he was just the janitor with broken English and worn-out shoes. They didn't know that every night while they were sleeping, he was inventing things. Literally, inventing. Drafting designs on the back of receipts, scribbling formulas on napkins, building prototypes with secondhand parts in the garage. He didn't tell anyone, not even me, until the patents started rolling in. And even then he told me, "Don't tell your mother yet. She'll just worry." That was his way, quiet, careful, always thinking 3 steps ahead. I remember being 7 years old, sitting cross-legged in the garage while he soldered wires onto a motherboard. I asked him, "Why don't you work in an office like the other dads?" He looked at me with that calm smile and said, "Because I'm building something that doesn't exist yet. And sometimes the world can't see you until you make it impossible to ignore you." I never forgot that. When he got sick, pancreatic cancer brutal and fast, I moved into his little apartment in Oakland. I didn't tell Jason. He would have rolled his eyes and said I was being too sentimental. But I didn't care. I spent those last weeks feeding him soup, helping him walk, recording his memories on my phone because I couldn't bear to forget the sound of his voice. One night just before he lost his ability to speak clearly, he reached out and handed me a key. It opened a small fireproof box under his bed. Inside, legal documents, banking information, and a handwritten list titled, "Things They Don't Know You Own." The list included 6 fully paid-off rental properties in San Jose, a brokerage account with over $4 million, a trust in my name containing a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, and finally, a silent holding company registered in Nevada with partial ownership of an HVAC technology firm. I sat on the floor stunned. The man everyone saw as just the janitor, he was a multimillionaire. He could have moved into a mansion, driven a Mercedes, retired decades earlier, but he didn't, because he believed in quiet control. "No one can take from you what they don't know you have," he once said. And now I finally understood. My father never met Beverly, but if he had, I know exactly what he would have done. He would have smiled at her, nodded politely, and then quietly bought the land under her feet. And he would have waited until the perfect moment to let her know. That was his way. Precision over rage. Planning over chaos. Now as I sat in my bedroom, the fireproof box open on the floor beside me, I felt something shift. The pain Beverly caused me no longer burned the same way. It didn't consume me anymore. It clarified me. She wanted to humiliate me, control me, destroy my dignity. But what she didn't know was that I had a man's legacy behind me. A legacy built not on status, but on brilliance, grit, and the deliberate refusal to be seen until the time was right. I spent that night going through every document, every account, every asset my father had tucked away. Then I began planning methodically, quietly, just as he would have. I didn't want to scream at Beverly. I didn't want to fight her. I wanted her to crumble slowly under the weight of a truth she never saw coming, that the woman she spat on, mocked, and dismissed as low class was richer than her, smarter than her, stronger than her. And not because I wore the right clothes or spoke with the right accent, but because I came from a man who knew that the best revenge is never loud. It's final. Jason still didn't notice the change in me. He still kissed me absent-mindedly, still assumed I'd take care of the house and call his mother to apologize just to smooth things over. But I didn't. Instead, I spent the next few days preparing the first move in a plan I knew my father would be proud of. A move that would remind Beverly exactly who I was. Not her charity case, not her son's sidekick, not a second-class daughter-in-law. I was Jasmine Tran, daughter of Vin Tran, and I was done hiding. It was tucked behind a pile of winter coats we never wore, the fireproof box. Not the one I opened the night of the dinner that held the will, the trust, the letters. This one was heavier, untouched. It had been collecting dust since my father passed away, and I'd almost forgotten about it. He told me once during one of his clearer days, "There's another box. You'll know when it's time." I thought he meant emotionally, spiritually, but now I understand he meant strategically. I opened it on a Wednesday afternoon while Jason was at work. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness you can hear in your bones. I took the box to the dining table, the same table where Beverly once criticized the way I held a wine glass, and placed it down like it was a sacred artifact. The lock clicked open. Inside were 4 thick envelopes, each labeled in my father's meticulous block handwriting. Leverage, contingency, inheritance, truth. My hands trembled as I reached for the first one. Envelope 1, leverage. It contained documents I never expected to see, photocopies of Beverly's old business filings, tax documents, and emails. At first I didn't understand how he got them. Then I saw the name at the top of the email thread, Glenn Harper, a real estate broker Beverly had once accused of embezzling funds from a failed project. Turns out she wasn't the victim. She was the instigator. My father, in his quiet, methodical way, had sniffed out the truth years ago. Tucked between the papers was a handwritten note. "No one gets to spit on my daughter and walk away clean." I started shaking, not with fear, with power. Envelope 2, contingency. This one was a master stroke. It contained legal documents prepared years in advance, giving me ownership of a shell company that had recently purchased the mortgage to Beverly's house. Quietly, anonymously. She didn't own her home anymore. I did. And she had no idea. There was also a draft letter addressed to her lawyer. "As the new lion holder, we are calling in the full balance due." My father had anticipated what I was too afraid to admit, that one day I'd need not just protection, but the means to strike. And he gave me both. Envelope 3. Inheritance inside were passcodes to offshore accounts, the trust documents I had already seen, and a sealed notarized letter stating I was the sole beneficiary of his estate. But it was the final line that made me cry. "Spend none of this in fear. Use it only when you've remembered who you are." Envelope 4, truth. This one was unexpected. Inside was a USB drive. I plugged it into my laptop. There were folders, photos, voice memos, and videos. My father had been documenting my life. Photos from school recitals, voicemails from me when I first met Jason. Even a screen recording of Beverly's public insult at our engagement party. Someone had uploaded it to social media years ago, and he'd saved it like evidence. He knew, he saw, and he was preparing me for war before I even knew there'd be one. When I finally closed the box, the sun had shifted in the room. Light spilled across the floor like a warning, or maybe a promise. I wasn't the same woman who sat quietly at Beverly's table all these years. That Jasmine is gone? What I had now was more than money, more than legal leverage. I had receipts. I had ownership. I had a box filled with answers to questions Beverly hadn't even asked yet. And for the first time in my life, I understood why silence was never weakness in my father's eyes. Because silence is only power if you own the moment when you finally speak. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden Beverly had once mocked me for designing. Too tropical. It looks like a jungle, she'd said. Funny. Now it felt like a jungle. And I was the predator, not the prey. Jason would be home in an hour. I had work to do, lawyers to call, foundations to initiate. Because Beverly's little empire of fake smiles, hushed slurs, and weaponized etiquette, it was about to burn, and she would have no idea who lit the match, until it was too late. They didn't see it coming because I didn't slam any doors. I didn't raise my voice, didn't cry in the bathroom, didn't storm out of a family dinner screaming about betrayal. That's not how you win with people like Beverly and Jason. You don't announce your departure, you erase yourself like smoke until all that's left is the consequences. It started with the bank. I visited in person wearing a beige cardigan, no makeup, and my hair tied back. I smiled at the teller, asked for account changes, quietly removed myself from our joint savings. I didn't touch the checking account that would have set off alarms, but the long-term savings that went into a new trust fund under my name, guarded by a legal firewall, even Jason couldn't pierce. I opened 2 new credit cards, one in my name, one under the holding company from my father's documents. Then I made a rule: no more emotional spending. Every dollar I used from this moment forward had to serve the plan. Jason barely noticed. He was busy planning his mother's birthday brunch. He handed me a list of caterers like I was the hired help and said, "Mom doesn't like spicy food. You'll remember that, right?" I nodded. I didn't remind him that I wasn't coming. Instead, I called my lawyer. We reviewed the prenup Beverly had insisted I sign before the wedding. I'd been too naive then to realize what she was doing, but ironically, it now worked in my favor. Jason had kept most of the assets in his name out of arrogance, while everything I had built quietly, my consulting income side investments, and now my inheritance was clean, untraceable, and untouchable. I also visited the county recorder's office. I began the process of buying their home, not directly, of course. That would have been too obvious. I funneled the transaction through one of my father's LLCs. Since Beverly had used the house as collateral for an unpaid line of credit, it was now in a distressed lien cycle. All I had to do was wait. Soon the lien would be sold at auction, and I would be the highest bidder. Meanwhile, I made myself smaller in the house. I cooked less, spoke less. I stopped initiating conversations, stopped picking out Jason's ties, stopped asking if he wanted coffee before work. He didn't even notice. He thought I was sulking, but I wasn't sulking. I was vanishing. And while I vanished, I watched. I listened. I documented. I started collecting digital evidence. Every backhanded message Beverly sent me, every voicemail where she mocked my family, every email where she accused me of being difficult or dramatic, they all went into a secure folder. I even installed a keystroke logger on our shared laptop, not to spy, but to track Jason's login activity. What I found shocked me more than any insult ever had. He'd been in contact with an ex. They'd been messaging for months, Nothing explicit but intimate in the way that cuts deepest. Sometimes I wish things were different. Jasmine doesn't understand me. You always made me feel safe. Safe. Funny how he never once asked if I felt safe with his mother hissing in my ear every holiday, or with him watching me drown in silence while calling it peace. At night I stopped sleeping beside him. I told him I had insomnia, that I needed melatonin and podcasts to drift off. He shrugged and went to bed without me. I moved my things into the guest room under the pretense of rest. But what I was really doing was building my war room. A whiteboard, a timeline, passwords, schedules, legal deadlines. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I calculated. I knew Beverly's birthday was in 2 weeks. I knew she would expect a party, a gift, a groveling performance from the daughter-in-law she thought she'd broken. What she would get instead? Eviction. Not from her home yet, but from my life, from my silence, from the illusion that I was ever hers to insult without consequence. I also made a will, not because I was afraid, but because I was finally planning for my future. Not ours, mine. I named a charity as beneficiary of 10% of my father's fortune, a scholarship for first-generation Asian American girls pursuing STEM degrees. The rest would go to the trust, and that trust would protect me from people like Beverly for the rest of my life. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I had disappeared emotionally, financially, and legally. Jason still kissed me goodbye without noticing the space between us had become a canyon. And Beverly, she was too busy planning centerpieces for her party to see the storm clouds forming behind her back. But storms don't knock before they break the roof. They just come. And I was almost ready. Beverly's birthday was always a production. Every year, she insisted on the same venue, an upscale garden cafe in Palo Alto, where they served overpriced salads and called it European charm. She'd rent the entire courtyard, invite 30 guests she barely liked, and treat it like her own coronation. This year was no different. Except for one thing. This year I smiled. I served. I performed. But every single breath I took was calculated. Because what she didn't know, what not a soul in that garden suspected, was that this would be her last birthday in that home. The last one she'd celebrate thinking I was beneath her. The last time she'd call me low class behind a mimosa. I arrived early as always. Jason handed me the seating chart like I was the help. Mom wants her sisters near the stage, he said, not even making eye contact. I nodded, smiled. Don't forget she's allergic to shellfish. Of course, I replied, even though I'd already custom-ordered everything weeks ago down to the lavender candles she hated. He walked off thinking I was doing this for Beverly. He had no idea I was doing this for me. Because this wasn't a party, it was a performance, a funeral in disguise. Beverly arrived 40 minutes late in a silk floral dress she'd probably picked just to look effortlessly youthful. She air-kissed everyone and barked orders before even thanking me. Jasmine, are those my gardenias on the table? I told you I prefer peonies. Gardenias are so pungent. She wrinkled her nose at me and whispered to Jason. She tries, bless her, but effort doesn't buy taste. Jason didn't defend me. Of course he didn't. He just patted her hand like she was some sweet little tyrant and said, "She means well." I clenched my teeth and smiled again. My face was starting to ache from the performance, but I kept smiling. Because I was about to enjoy the best act of all. As everyone gathered for the toast, I stepped forward with a wrapped box, elegant, heavy, tied with a gold ribbon. Inside was a simple envelope, a card, and an eviction notice, but I didn't give it to her just yet. That moment would come later when the room was full, when the wine was flowing, when her ego was stretched wide and unguarded. Instead, I lifted my glass. To Beverly Tran, wife, mother, mentor, a woman of taste, tradition, and determination. Everyone clapped. Beverly preened. I continued. You've built a home full of values, structure, and family pride, and today we celebrate that legacy, because soon things will change. She tilted her head, curious, smug. But for now, let's raise a toast to the matriarch of this dynasty and all that she thinks she controls. Laughter. She didn't understand what I meant. Not yet. After cake, I approached her, alone, in full view of the guests but under the hum of cafe chatter. I handed her the gold box and said, "Your real gift is inside, but maybe wait until the end of the party to open it." She rolled her eyes. "If this is another one of your thoughtful handmade things, Jasmine, it's a transfer of sorts." I said, tone calm. "Something you earned." I walked away before she could answer, because I needed her to open it at home, where she'd be alone, where Jason would be close enough to witness the meltdown, but not quick enough to stop it, where the walls would echo. That night I watched from the upstairs hallway as Jason stomped through the house in a rage. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, holding the paper. The eviction notice, signed by a company he didn't recognize because I'd hidden the ownership trail 5 layers deep. Beverly followed behind him, her makeup smudged, shrieking, "How dare you after everything I've done for you, after everything she's taken?" "Taken," I whispered, stepping down the stairs. "All I've done is take back what's mine, quietly, just like you taught me, Beverly." She stared at me, trembling. "You don't own this house," she hissed. I smiled. "Not in your name, not in Jason's. But I own the mortgage. I own the lien. And as of this morning, I filed to call the debt in full." Silence. Then I added, "You have 30 days. Happy birthday." Jason demanded an explanation. He shouted, slammed drawers, called me vindictive, ungrateful, and finally manipulative. But none of it landed. Because he knew. He knew he'd let this happen. He knew that when his mother spat in my face, he stayed silent. He knew I was done playing the part. And that's when he truly panicked. Not because of the money, but because for the first time since we met, he was powerless. Beverly collapsed into a chair and whispered, "You planned this all along." I walked over, knelt beside her, looked her in the eye. "No, I endured you for years. That was the plan. This is just the consequence." And then I walked away, up the stairs, past the wedding photos, past the hallway mirror. And for the first time in years, I saw my reflection clearly. Not a low-class girl, not a background character in someone else's family drama, but a woman who waited, watched, survived, and struck. It arrived on a Thursday. A manila envelope, thick and silent, slipped under my office door by a courier with no name. I had hired the private investigator 3 months prior, long before the birthday brunch, back when Beverly's comments still made me clench my jaw hard enough to give myself migraines. Back then, I didn't know what I was looking for. Just a hunch. An instinct that someone who spat venom so effortlessly surely had secrets of her own. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. By the time I finished reading, I felt nothing. Not rage, not triumph, just confirmation. Beverly Tran wasn't just cruel, she was criminal. The report was meticulous. My investigator, an old contact of my father's, didn't miss a single thread. First, there were gambling debts. Not just weekend trips to Reno, 6-figure wire transfers to illegal online gambling accounts registered under pseudonyms. She was good at hiding them. Better than most, but not good enough. Then came the loans, predatory ones taken out in the name of a defunct floral business she had closed 5 years ago, but kept on paper to funnel her transactions through. And finally the kicker. She had forged my signature. It happened 2 years ago. Jason had been talking about refinancing the house. Beverly insisted on helping with the paperwork. She said she knew a broker who moves fast. Turns out she submitted documents to that broker with my name signed as a secondary guarantor. It was subtle, quiet. But the handwriting analysis didn't lie, and the witness signature was someone who didn't even exist. A ghost name. The worst part, Jason knew. The investigator had text records Jason asking Beverly if the documents were safe and if Jasmine would ever find out. And Beverly had replied, "She's too soft. She won't even notice. Besides, she owes us." That one word, owes, set me on fire. Always. I'd spent years cooking meals for a woman who ridiculed my culture. I'd forfeited holidays with my family, given up job promotions to play housemaid to her dysfunctional dynasty. I'd massaged her ego, babysat her guests, organized her closets, and smiled while she called me exotic. And now I was the one in debt. No, no more. I made 3 phone calls that day. First to my lawyer. We initiated a quiet investigation of the forged loan. If I chose to press charges, Beverly could face real consequences. But my lawyer advised patience. Strategic silence. Don't show your hand yet, she said. Let her get comfortable again. Second, I called the private investigator. I wired him a bonus and asked him to shift focus. Jason, I said, I need to know everything. And third, I called the bank that held the forged documents. They confirmed my name was on file, but when I requested a full authorization record, there were glaring red flags. It would only take a court order to uncover the fraud. But I didn't act right away. Because true revenge, isn't about exposing someone in the moment they expect it. It's about letting them build their house of cards right before you flick the base. That night, Jason asked me if I was okay. He'd been walking on eggshells since Beverly's birthday. You've been quiet, he said. We should talk. I almost laughed. Now he wanted to talk. But I played along. I've just been thinking a lot, I said. About debts, about family, about what people owe each other. He looked at me like he couldn't tell if I was angry or deranged. I'm trying, he said. You have to believe that. I stared at him. Belief is earned, Jason. You're running on credit. Later, while he was asleep, I opened my laptop and typed up a document. It was a timeline. A clean, factual breakdown of every financial deceit Beverly had ever pulled involving me, complete with copies of the forged document, screenshots of texts, and a list of witnesses. At the top, I titled it, Tran Veers Tran, Evidence of Malicious Financial Abuse. I saved it in a cloud drive, password protected, shared with 2 lawyers and my executor. Not because I was planning to use it that day, but because power is about options. And now I had every option in the world. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror that night and looked at myself long and hard. This wasn't the girl who used to apologize for speaking too loudly. This wasn't the woman who wore beige because bright colors aren't sophisticated. This was the daughter of Vin Tran, and I was about to dismantle everything Beverly had built, one signature at a time. Ownership isn't always loud. It doesn't have to come with banners or locks or court orders taped to the front door. Sometimes it looks like silence. A document filed, a deed transferred, a debt quietly called in. Sometimes owning someone's life means letting them keep pretending they're in charge right up until the moment they realize they're not. It happened in stages. After I confirmed Beverly had forged my signature on the refinancing paperwork, I waited. I let her believe the party drama had passed. Jason started acting like things were returning to normal. He began inviting me to family dinners again, gently testing the waters with lines like, Mom was just under stress that day. She didn't mean it like that. You've got to admit you can be intense sometimes. I nodded, smiled, and in the background I continued building the final blow. You see, Beverly's house, the pride of her so-called dynasty, was a palace built on borrowed time. My investigator had already uncovered the mountain of loans, and once I tracked down the mortgage company that had picked up her debt, I quietly offered to buy it out. Not in my name, of course. Through an entity my father had established years ago, Tran Meridian Holdings. It sounded corporate, faceless, exactly the way Beverly liked her enemies. She wouldn't know who held her leash until it was too late. The deal closed on a Tuesday morning. It took less than an hour. I sat across from the bank's representative in a gray suit, and calm eyes signed 3 forms, wired the money through one of the trust accounts, and walked out with ownership of Beverly's mortgage. The home she bragged about in every social circle, the one she decorated with European influence and guarded like a castle, was now mine. And she didn't even know it. Power is funny that way. It doesn't always come from screaming louder. Sometimes it comes from knowing you don't have to speak at all. I could have shown up that afternoon with a copy of the deed and a smirk, but I didn't. Instead, I watched from a distance. I watched her plan a garden party, heard her complain to Jason that the landscaper was late as always, watched her brag on Facebook about being debt-free and thriving. And I waited. A week later, I mailed her a notice. Polite, professional, no branding. Just a plain white envelope addressed from Tran Meridian Holdings alerting her that her new lien holder would be adjusting repayment terms. She called Jason in a panic. "Do you know anything about this? Who are these people?" "Why would they call the note early?" Jason shrugged. "I don't know." Because he didn't. I never told him. I didn't need to. I met with a lawyer that afternoon. We drafted a proposal Beverly could either begin full repayment $487,000 within 60 days or relinquish ownership and vacate the property. She wouldn't qualify for a refinance. Not with her debt. Not with the forged documents still floating in the wind ready to resurface. She had 2 months left to live in the home she once told me I couldn't afford to dust. The clock was ticking. Jason tried to confront me when he found out. "What the hell is Tran Meridian? You did this, didn't you?" I didn't even blink. "No, Jason. Your mother did this. I just made sure the bill finally came due." He looked at me with something between confusion and fear. "Why would you go this far?" I smiled. "Because I don't scream in people's faces, Jason. I just buy the air they breathe." That night Beverly called me. The voicemail was a mix of shrieking and begging. She swung wildly between denial and rage. "You think you've won, I'll fight this in court. You're a thief. You're nothing." And then near the end, "Please, please don't do this. This is my home." I played the message twice. Then I deleted it. I didn't need to respond. Because ownership doesn't argue. It doesn't need validation. It just exists. In a single move, I had taken everything she used to control me. The house, the legacy, the illusion of superiority. And I'd done it without ever raising my voice. Beverly used to say I had no power because I didn't make noise. But now, she was screaming into a void, and I was the one deciding if the echo came back. The invitation came in a thick cream envelope monogrammed, sealed with wax, and smelling faintly of overpriced perfume. Beverly's brunch. Her goodbye summer gathering held annually at the country club where she paraded her pearls, her perfectly arranged fruit platters, and her carefully curated lies. The guest list always included a mix of board members' wives, church acquaintances, and distant cousins who owed her favors. This year she made sure to hand-deliver my invitation through Jason. "She says it would be rude if you didn't come," he muttered, not looking me in the eye. I accepted, with a smile, because it wasn't just a brunch anymore. It was the stage for her fall. I dressed carefully that morning. Nothing flashy. Beverly hated attention-seeking outfits. So I wore something neutral, understated, dangerously polite. But in my bag, folded twice and pressed flat, was the final notice from Tran Meridian Holdings. Eviction order. Deadline 21 days. Cause failure to remit full payment. It was legally airtight, served properly, and irrevocable. I hadn't come to make a scene. I'd come to end a legacy. When I arrived, Beverly was already basking in her circle of admiration. Her voice cut through the courtyard like a blade covered in frosting. "Oh, Jasmine, you made it, and you look so put together today." Put together, as if I were a toddler who'd finally learned to tie her shoes. I kissed her on the cheek and smiled. I wouldn't miss it. This might be a historic day. She laughed, oblivious. "We're announcing some changes soon. Jason and I might even be expanding the family business. Big things ahead. Big things." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The brunch unfolded like it always did, champagne flutes, stale compliments, stories retold so many times they'd fossilized. Beverly gave her usual speech about legacy grit and the strength of traditional family values. In times like these, she said, lifting her glass, you rely on roots, on family, and on the home you build with your bare hands. I let her have her moment. Let the clapping rise. Then when the plates were cleared and the check was settled, I stood. "Actually, Beverly," I said before we all go, "I brought a little something for you." She blinked. The table turned. I reached into my bag and handed her the envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "It's a change in ownership," I said, tone flat. "A new beginning." She laughed nervously, opening it slowly, expecting maybe a framed quote or a spa gift certificate. Then she read. Once, twice. Her hands began to tremble. This is a joke. It's not. You can't this, Jason? Jason rushed to her side, read the paper, paled. This has to be a mistake. No, I said calmly. It's a purchase, a legal transfer of the mortgage, and now a default, which leads to this notice. I turned to Beverly. You have 3 weeks to vacate. The table went dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Beverly looked like the floor had dropped out from under her heels. You're evicting your own family. No, I replied, still smiling. I'm evicting my abuser. The silence cracked. Whispers erupted. Someone stood and walked away. Beverly grabbed the back of a chair like she might faint or throw it. After everything I've done for you, I tilted my head. You mean the insults, the forged loan documents, or the spit? Jason stepped forward. You're blowing this out of proportion. No, I said, locking eyes with him. You are. You let her humiliate me. You let her commit fraud in my name. You watched her break me and called it tradition. I turned back to Beverly, voice low but sharp enough to slice glass. The home you bragged about, I own it now, and the door's closing, for good. I walked away without waiting for applause, without waiting for screams, because power doesn't wait for approval. It simply ends things. And that day at that brunch table covered in fruit and fake affection, I ended her reign. Jason didn't come home that night. Not right away anyway. I knew where he went to Beverly's, to pick up the pieces, to listen to her cry and rage and call me every name in the book, to do what he'd always done, stand next to her, not between us. I poured myself a glass of wine and waited, not out of longing, out of certainty. Because when you flip someone's entire world upside down, they always come back, not for answers, for control. He walked in around 11 p.m., slammed the door hard enough to rattle the floorboards, and started shouting before he even reached the living room. What the hell did you just do? I didn't flinch. You read the letter? I followed the law. You embarrassed my mother in front of everyone. You humiliated her. I sipped my wine. She spat on me, Jason. Remember that? Or is it only humiliating when it happens to her? His face flushed. He wasn't used to me speaking like this. Not after all these years. He took a step forward. You went too far. No, Jason, I said, calm as a surgeon. I went just far enough. He ranted. He called me vindictive, petty, dangerous. He threw phrases like, you'll regret this and you've destroyed our family. But somewhere in the middle of his tirade, I saw the truth. He didn't care about the house or the brunch. He cared that he no longer had control. That the wife who once folded his ties and apologized for her accent was now sitting in their living room sipping Cabernet, owning everything he thought he inherited. Then came the line that broke everything. You should be grateful my mother ever accepted you. My eyes locked on his, and I laughed. A single short, bitter laugh that echoed against the walls of the home I had funded fixed, and unbeknownst to him nearly fully paid off. Accepted me, I repeated. She forged my signature. She used me for a loan. She called me a dog behind my back. And you let her. You stood there and told me not to overreact. And now you want gratitude. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. You don't understand. This isn't how we do things. No, Jason, I said quietly. This is how I do things now. I reached into the side drawer and pulled out an envelope. He recognized it instantly. Divorce papers. He staggered back like I'd struck him. You're ending this over a fight. I stood. No, I'm ending this over years of silence. Over every dinner where she insulted me and you let her. Over every apology I gave that neither of you deserved. Over every time I made myself small so you could feel big. I stepped forward. You never protected me, Jason, and now you're shocked that I learned to protect myself. He refused to touch the envelope. He tried guilt. What about everything I gave up for you? Like what I asked. Letting me pay half the bills, asking me to cancel job interviews so I could host your family parties. You didn't give up anything. You took. And then came the final blow. You were just the buffer between me and my mother. That's when it clicked. He hadn't married me to build a life. He'd married me to be a shield, something soft to absorb Beverly's venom, something pretty and polite to distract from his own cowardice. And now that I wasn't shielding him anymore, he was exposed and unraveling. He finally took the envelope, didn't open it, didn't speak, just stood there stunned as the world he'd always controlled cracked under his feet. "You're going to regret this," he muttered. I met his eyes one last time. "No, Jason, I regretted staying. This is liberation." When he left, he slammed the door again, but this time I smiled, because I wasn't his wife anymore. I wasn't Beverly's victim. I wasn't anyone's scapegoat. I was Jasmine Tran. I was free. And soon he'd be the one answering questions he could no longer silence. The very next week, whispers began. At first they were soft, tentative glances, hushed conversations behind fluttering fans, curious looks at Beverly's strained smile. But soon the ripple became a wave. It started with her sisters. Cousins who once laughed at my exotic stories now approached me quietly, dropping bits of overheard gossip rumors of Beverly's gambling debts, of late-night fights with Jason, even whispers of an affair with her own brother-in-law. One by one they turned. I remember the day Aunt Helen cornered me at the grocery store. "Jasmine," she said, voice low, eyes wary. I never wanted to believe it, but Beverly's been hiding a lot. And it's not just money. I nodded, careful not to betray my knowledge. "What exactly?" I asked. "Debt collectors, lawsuits, that forged loan you found." That was just the tip, and some strange late-night visitors at the house. At a family gathering, I saw the shift clearly. Beverly sat alone, isolated. The usual crowd avoided her gaze, exchanged knowing smirks, and whispered in corners. "She's lost control," someone muttered. "About time," said another. Even Jason wavered. When he called to ask if we could talk again, his voice was brittle. "Mom's not well. The family's fracturing." "Good," I said. "Maybe now they'll see who she really is." The public facade she'd maintained, perfect matriarch pillar of strength, crumbled under the weight of truth. Social invitations dried up. Business partners distanced themselves. And the neighbors, they stopped returning her waves. I didn't gloat, because vengeance isn't a celebration. It's a quiet justice, a reckoning. And as Beverly's world collapsed around her, I found something I hadn't expected. Peace. With Beverly's empire crumbling, I knew my fight wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about transforming pain into purpose. My father had always believed in education, the key to breaking cycles, the path to freedom. He never had the chance to finish college, but he made sure I did. And now, with his fortune and my voice, I could help others like me. I established the Vintran Foundation, a scholarship fund for first-generation Asian American girls pursuing degrees in STEM fields. I named it after my father to honor his sacrifices, his quiet brilliance, and the dreams he never saw fulfilled. The first scholarship ceremony was emotional. I stood on stage looking out at young women who reminded me of myself, hopeful, determined yet burdened by barriers I knew too well. I was told I was low-class, unworthy, invisible, I said. But my father taught me that true power isn't in wealth or status. It's in resilience, in lifting others as you rise. The foundation grew quickly. Local news covered it. Community leaders reached out. And for the first time, I felt like I was building a legacy that mattered beyond family grudges and bitter battles. Even Beverly heard about it. The woman who once spat in my face now faced the reality of a daughter-in-law who wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. That chapter of my life was closing, but the book, it was just beginning. Once the pillars of her carefully constructed world began to fall, Beverly unraveled fast. Gone was the matriarch with a sharp tongue and sharper smiles. Now she was a woman reduced to begging first in whispers, then in shouts. She showed up at my door one rainy afternoon, soaked and desperate. "Jasmine, please," she whispered, eyes red, voice cracking. "I made mistakes. I was wrong. Can we talk?" I looked at her, her once proud posture now slumped, her pearls replaced by chipped nails and trembling hands. Inside, she admitted to the debts, the lies, the fraud. She confessed the affair, the gambling, the betrayal of the family she once ruled. But there were no excuses. only raw, broken regret. I didn't hug her. I didn't curse her. I simply handed her a small envelope. "This is for a women's shelter," I said quietly. "It's a fresh start." She stared at me, tears streaming down her face. "I don't deserve this." I shook my head. "No one does. But some of us choose to build instead of burn." Beverly left that day without a word more, and I watched her walk away knowing this was both an end and a beginning. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about choosing the path forward. The coastal home was quiet. Waves crashed softly against the shore, a rhythmic reminder that life moves forward no matter the storms behind it. I stood on the balcony, breathing in the salty air, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders. This wasn't just a house. It was my sanctuary, a symbol of every sacrifice, every wound, every victory. I looked at the framed photo on the mantel, the one of my father smiling quietly in his work shirt hands stained with years of labor. He had taught me the value of patience, the power of silence, and the strength in planning. I had lived those lessons well. I had been a quiet shadow in their world, tolerated but dismissed. But now I was the architect of my own destiny. No longer a victim of Beverly's cruelty, no longer trapped by Jason's indifference. I was free. I was whole. I was unstoppable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I opened my journal and wrote. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought I'd bend, break, or beg. But I was waiting, watching, and now I rise. This was my new beginning, a life built not on their approval, but on my own terms, a legacy forged in silence and steel.